The Bible speaks of a race of vampire-like beings that roamed the pre-flood world, and we're told just how terrible these beings truly were. I will also recite some scriptures in the rapidly growing Book of Enoch, which is one of the missing books of the Holy Bible. First, let's go back to how what can only be described as biblical vampires came to be. The story begins when angels came to earth interbreeding with women. These women are referred to as the daughters of men, emphasizing the fact that some sort of unnatural sequence took place between human women and angelic entities. Nonetheless, what the Bible describes as the Nephilim came to be. The Bible describes these creatures as giants, monsters, and even something far worse. At first, these Nephilim started off fairly normal, yet there was one nuisance. Due to the Nephilim's enormous size, they needed a great amount of food in order to sustain such a massive body. So, the Nephilim began to consume all of humans' resources, until there was barely anything left for humans. And then things took a turn for the worse. Once humans could no longer provide such a ridiculous amount of food for these Nephilim to consume, the Nephilim ultimately began consuming humans themselves. This is the first sight we get of a vampire-type creature in the Bible. The Nephilim began to crave the blood not only of humans, but of every living creature on earth. The Book of Enoch paints a vivid image of just how chaotic things began to get in the pre-flood world, once the Nephilim transformed into a vampire-like apex predator. This entire graphic scene is in chapter 7 of the Book of Enoch. It reads, "And all the others together with them took unto themselves wives, and each chose for himself one, and they began to go in unto them and to defile themselves with them. And they taught them charms and enchantments and the cutting of roots and made them acquainted with plants. And they became pregnant, and they bare great giants, whose height was 3,000 ells, who consumed all the acquisitions of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. And they began to sin against birds, and beasts, and reptiles, and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. Then the earth laid accusation against the lawless ones." This chapter of the Book of Enoch is detailing when fallen angels came to earth and created such beings, and also what these beings came to be. Now let's take a minute to let that sink in. A bloodthirsty human-like species sounds a bit familiar, doesn't it? Well, it doesn't only end there. The concept of the vampire as an undead creature inflicting harm originated in Eastern Europe, specifically in Bulgaria about 1,000 years ago. Make no mistake, this was a legend isolated among the Slavic people. It was not widespread or well-known. As a word, vampire translates roughly as ghost monster, and that label gives insight about these early beliefs. Slavic vampires were non-corporeal, lacking a physical body, having more in common with a poltergeist. The vampire wrought havoc, often as a spreader of disease in a village, but the vampire did not create other vampires with its bite, and it didn't consume blood. It was a ghost-like being. The vampire entered Western history, leaving its seclusion fairly late. War is to blame for spreading the belief. In 1686, 6 years prior to the Salem witch trials, the German-speaking peoples of the Holy Roman Empire gained control of Hungary, and thereby took control of a Slavic population. Imperial troops learned the vampire legend from Slavic peasants during the occupation. Soldiers carried the idea to cosmopolitan centers like Vienna and Berlin. From there, the vampire moved to Paris. From Paris to London. From London to the Americas. The word vampire first appeared in English in 1732, the same year George Washington was born. Traveling east to west, the vampire legend took on new features. Rather than a ghost, for example, the vampire became a risen corpse, full-bodied. Most notably, the vampire assumed the need to consume blood. This addition to the legend was an 18th century Western idea. Believe it or not, blood drinking added a scientific element to the vampire belief. To the people of the time, blood consumption made the vampire more believable, more corporeal than incorporeal, more scientific than supernatural. Westerners were moving past the age of superstition. Witchcraft was decriminalized in Britain and its colonies in 1735, So intellectuals of the time, when confronted with vampiric testimonies, conceived vampirism as a disease rather than supernatural occurrence. In the 1700s, human blood was believed to possess medicinal qualities, and it was widely consumed as medicine throughout Europe and the Americas by people at all levels of society. Today, historians call this medicinal cannibalism. Blood was cheap in cost due to the common use of bloodletting as a physician's tool. Blood was believed to be the vessel of the human soul, and by imbibing blood, one imbibed life. Even the Bible says this in Leviticus 17:11, saying, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make an atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that maketh an atonement for the soul." Human blood was prescribed for everything from epilepsy to failing eyesight in the 1700s. The vampire of the West, therefore, was medically savvy, and the dead creature, it came to be believed, consumed blood to restore life. In modern times, the vampire is generally held to be a fictitious entity, although belief in similar vampiric creatures, such as the chupacabra, still persists in some cultures. The charismatic and sophisticated vampire of modern fiction was born in 1819 with the publication of The Vampire by the English writer John Polidori. The story was highly successful and arguably the most influential vampire work of the early 19th century. Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula is remembered as the quintessential vampire novel and provided the basis of the modern vampire legend, even though it was published after fellow Irish author Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu's 1872 novel Carmilla. The success of this book spawned a distinctive vampire genre, still popular in the 21st century, with books, films, television shows, and video games. The vampire has since become a dominant figure in the horror genre. I can't help but to notice the abundant similarities between demons and the original vampire entity. I'll describe this particular comparison after I explain how demons came to be in the first place. By now, we know of the Great Flood, but did you know this incident alone created demons? The Book of Enoch tells us how the Nephilim perished in the flood, but their souls remained. And their souls are what we would call demons. I must note that the Book of Enoch is 1,000 years older than the vampire legend, so perhaps the Slavic people were referring to these demonic entities. And here's why I say that. Firstly, the vampire originally was known as a demonic spirit, and demons themselves are known as beings that feed on human fear, sadness, anger, depression, and other negative emotions. Apparently, negative emotions make demons stronger due to them being a parasite-type spirit. This seems like the traditional vampire behavior, feeding upon humans for the energy our soul produces. Many people believe vampires are physically here still. One day in 1725, in the small village of Kisiljevo in eastern Serbia, a local peasant named Petar Blagojevich was buried in the village churchyard with the familiar ceremony of a Catholic funeral. Within 9 days of Petar being laid to rest, 9 locals had gone from healthy to deceased. From young to old, they all showed signs of nervous exhaustion. Every one of these 9 people stated outright on their deathbeds that Petar Blagojevich was the sole reason their health was declining so rapidly. They all claimed that he had come into their bedrooms at night as a vampire, sat on them, and then took their strength away. It was also said that Blagojevich, after his departure, went to his old family home and did the same to his son by drinking his blood. When Petar's grave was opened up, in the presence of the whole village, the hair, nails, and beard had grown, and fresh blood was seen in the mouth. At around 6 a.m. on Sunday, 16th of April 1922, a man walking along a deserted Coventry Street in London suddenly felt the presence of a man or thing grab hold of him tightly, sink its teeth into his neck, and draw blood out. The next thing he knew, he was in Charing Cross Hospital being told by bemused doctors that his neck had been punctured by something resembling a long, thin spike. Astonishingly, the same thing happened to 2 more unsuspecting victims later that day, both in the same spot as the first. The police and Londoners were baffled, and no suspect was ever identified. An off-duty policeman in a pub was apparently overheard saying that the police had hired a vampire hunter. This modern-day Van Helsing supposedly tracked the monster down to Highgate Cemetery and then finished it off in the traditional way, by opening up its coffin and driving a stake through its heart. More intriguing still was an incident that occurred around the same time in West Drayton, about 15 miles west of Coventry Street. On the night of the full moon, several local people reported seeing a huge bat with a 6-foot wingspan flying around the churchyard, ducking in and out of graves and mausoleums. The police went to the scene and spotted the creature, which screamed and flew away. It is not known whether these two incidents were connected, but an old man in West Drayton remarked at the time that a vampire had been active there some 30 years before taking the life of a local woman by biting her neck and draining her blood. After April 1922, nothing more was heard of either the West Drayton bat or the Coventry Street vampire. Egyptians also had their share of vampire lore and bloodsuckers. The Egyptian goddess Sekhmet was known for her taste for blood, and according to the Egyptian Book of the Dead, if a certain part of the soul called the Ka didn't receive adequate offerings, it left the tomb to drink blood. Sekhmet was a formidable and revered deity in the pantheon of ancient Egyptian gods, stands as the embodiment of power, healing, and protection. Often depicted with the head of a lioness, Sekhmet is associated with both destructive and beneficial forces, showcasing the complex nature of ancient Egyptian beliefs. While not like typical vampires of folklore today, she is seen as one of the original bloodsuckers in mythology, inspiring the vampires of today.